The war was over, but the fear had not yet faded. In April 1945, as trains clattered west through a quiet, unfamiliar countryside, hundreds of German prisoners sat in silence, watching endless miles of green American farmland roll past their windows. For years they had imagined this land as a myth, factories without limits, people without hunger, a nation that built machines faster than Europe could destroy them. Now they were its captives. Most of them expected punishment. Rumors had spread all across the front. American soldiers tortured prisoners, starved them, made them dig their own graves. The propaganda leaflets had promised nothing but misery, so they arrived at the camp gates with hollow faces and guarded eyes, bracing for what they thought would be their final humiliation. But what they saw instead left them speechless. Behind the barbed wire stood rows of white barracks, tidy gardens, a baseball diamond chalked fresh, and men in crisp uniforms waving them forward, not with rifles aimed, but with clipboards and smiles. A line formed outside the mess hall, and the smell that drifted through the air didn't smell like war at all. It smelled of fried meat, warm bread, and sugar. Inside, on long wooden tables, bottles of Coca-Cola glistened in the light, and a metal freezer truck hummed beside the wall, its lid lifted to reveal tubs of vanilla ice cream. For a moment, no one moved. Then one young private, his boots still caked with the mud of the Rhine, whispered, "Das ist unglitch. This can't be real." A guard handed him a bottle anyway, twisting off the cap with a church key and nodding toward the dessert line. He took a sip. It burned and sparkled and tasted like nothing he had ever known. The ice cream melted on his tongue, cold and soft. It wasn't victory, but it felt like peace. Only weeks earlier, these same men had been marching through ruined cities, stepping over rubble that once were bakeries and cinemas. They had seen mothers trade wedding rings for a loaf of bread, children scraping soot for warmth. At home, food had become memory. Here, in the heart of their enemy's land, abundance looked effortless. One prisoner murmured that if this was defeat, he couldn't imagine what victory would look like. Their fear began to unravel in small moments. An American corporal pointed out the washroom, explained the daily schedule, told them when mail would be collected. Every instruction came with politeness, almost casual. He didn't shout. He didn't gloat. The prisoners watched him, puzzled by a discipline that didn't rely on terror. That night, in the barracks, they whispered about it. Some said it was a trick, that the food was meant to soften them before interrogation. Others said maybe the Americans simply didn't care enough to hate them. Hans Keller lay awake, staring at the ceiling boards, the taste of sugar still lingering. He was 22, a farm boy from Thuringia, who had fought through Normandy and the Ardennes until his unit disintegrated. Captured outside Rumagani, he had expected a bullet. Instead, the Americans offered him a cigarette. Now, listening to the hum of the camp generator and the distant sound of someone laughing, an actual, unguarded laugh, he wondered if everything he had believed had been wrong. Days turned into routine. Roll call at sunrise. Work details on local farms or repair crews. Meals served on time, every time. The guards were mostly young men, not much older than the prisoners, and conversations began cautiously, trading words across language gaps. Hans discovered that many Americans had German grandparents. Some even spoke phrases their mothers had taught them. The prisoners began to sense a strange familiarity. The enemy spoke like cousins, separated by an ocean. When the first Sunday arrived, a local minister offered a short service in English and halting German. Afterward, townspeople approached the fence with baskets, apples, bread, a few bottles of soda left from ration stock. It was meant as goodwill. Nothing more, but the gesture sent a wave through the camp. One prisoner said quietly, "They are feeding the men who burned their sons." No one knew how to respond. The rumor of ice cream spread to every barrack. New arrivals refused to believe it until they saw the white truck roll in again, frost shining on the metal. In Germany, even milk had vanished from stores. Now they were being served cream, sugar, and cold sweetness in glass bowls. It felt impossible that a nation at war could spare such luxury for its enemies. But that was the point. The Americans wanted every POW to see what Germany could never give them enough of everything. Letters were censored, but permitted. Hans wrote to his mother on thin stationery provided by the camp. He told her that he was alive, that he was treated well, that he had eaten more in 1 week than in his last 3 months at home. He hesitated before adding the detail that would seem unbelievable. They gave us Coca-Cola. He imagined her reading that line in a dark apartment in Leipzig and shaking her head. The guards laughed easily, but their laughter never felt cruel. During mealtimes, they shared cigarettes and stories of their own dust storms in Kansas. Baseball teams, dances before shipping out. Hans listened, fascinated by how ordinary their lives sounded. They weren't warriors from a propaganda poster. They were mechanics, farmers, and students who just wanted to go home. The more he learned about them, the more he realized how little he'd known about America. One afternoon, while loading crates near the kitchen, Hans caught sight of a delivery label. Hershey, Pennsylvania. He had heard the name before on chocolate wrappers scavenged in France. The Americans were importing sweets by the ton, not for themselves alone, but for prisoners, hospitals, and even foreign civilians. It was industry as compassion, and it unnerved him more than any weapon. At night, the prisoners listened to the radio through the mess hall loudspeaker. American stations played swing music between news bulletins. The rhythm was unlike anything from Home Free, Careless, Confident. Some of the younger guards tried to teach them steps, laughing when the Germans stumbled over the beat. For the first time since the war began, laughter no longer felt like defiance. It felt like recovery. When new groups of POS arrived from Europe, their faces drawn and suspicious, the older prisoners met them with reassurance. Don't worry. You'll eat, you'll sleep, you'll see. They guided them to the line where the soda bottles clinked and the ice cream steamed faintly in the summer heat. Some of the newcomers wept openly, overcome by the sheer absurdity of it. In their minds, the Americans were supposed to be barbarians. Instead, they behaved like hosts at a country fair. For Hans, the realization came slowly that the Americans weren't performing kindness, they were simply being themselves. Abundance had made mercy easy. They could afford to be generous because nothing could threaten their supply. Every truck that rolled past the camp carried proof of a victory that went beyond weapons. A victory of systems, of factories, of people who believed there would always be more tomorrow. He began to see how the war must have looked from the other side. While Germany rationed every crumb, the United States built so much that even its prisoners lived in surplus. That truth cut deeper than defeat. It meant the war had been lost long before the front collapsed. It had been lost in assembly lines and cornfields, in the quiet confidence of a nation that never knew scarcity. Still, guilt lingered. When he rode home again, Hans avoided describing the comfort too plainly. He didn't want to hurt his family or seem ungrateful for surviving. He simply wrote, "We are treated fairly. Do not worry for me." But in his mind, he replayed that first day. The sound of the bottle cap popping, the fizz rising to his nose, the taste of ice and sweetness when he thought the world had ended. Some nights he wondered what the guards thought of them. Did they see them as enemies, or just as men on the wrong side of a terrible choice? He never asked. The kindness was enough. And as weeks turned into months, the prisoners began to rebuild themselves. They tended gardens, learned English phrases, painted signs, mended fences. Each small task returned a piece of dignity. By midsummer, the camp looked less like a prison and more like a small, ordered village. American officers noticed the change and encouraged it. They believed that treating men humanely would make them better citizens when they returned home. For Hans, that idea felt almost impossible. Germany was rubble, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. If a nation could feed its enemies, maybe it could also forgive them. One evening, as the sun burned low across the plains, a truck arrived carrying supplies for the weekend. Among the crates was a wooden box packed with ice and glass bottles of Coca-Cola. Again, the guards handed them out like celebration gifts. Someone found a phonograph and played Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. The music drifted through the wire fences, mixing with the laughter of men who had once sworn to destroy each other. Hans raised his bottle to the fading light. He didn't know what peace would look like for Germany, but he knew how it tasted: sweet, cold, and entirely unexpected. They had been told that surrender meant death. From the first weeks of training, every German soldier learned that the enemy, the Americans, the British, the Russians, would show no mercy. Propaganda leaflets warned that Allied troops tortured prisoners, that they shot them after interrogation, that capture meant dishonor. On the Eastern Front, that fear had been justified. But on the Western Front, it was something else entirely, a shadow built by lies. Hans Keller remembered those warnings clearly. In 1944, when his regiment was pinned outside St. Lay, his company sergeant told them that no one taken by the Americans would ever return. He had seen posters plastered in towns showing caricatures of Allied guards grinning behind barbed wire, beating German soldiers, letting them starve. Better to die for the fatherland, the sergeant said, than live as an animal. For months, Hans believed it. He'd seen enough in France to expect cruelty from anyone wearing a different uniform. The sky thundered every night from Allied bombers. Columns of refugees filled the roads. Rumors spread of prisoners lined up and shot. Whether they were true didn't matter. Belief made them real. By the winter of 1945, his unit was exhausted, reduced to half strength, retreating through a landscape of smoke and ruin. Hunger was constant. Ammunition was low. Orders came from nowhere. They fought because stopping meant capture, and capture meant the unknown. When the Americans broke through near Remagen, his company was surrounded. It happened quietly, not with shouting or fire, but with silence. Tanks rolled up behind them at dawn, and within minutes their rifles were on the ground. Hans waited for the shot that would end it. Instead, an American soldier with dust on his face handed him a tin of rations. "Eat," the man said simply. No insults, no blows. Just food. That first bite, a square of chocolate, half melted in the sun, didn't taste like victory or defeat. It tasted like confusion. The enemy was feeding him. Another guard gave him water. Someone joked, in broken German, "Camp diced fertig," the fight's over. And that was it. The war, at least for him, had ended not with a bang, but with an act of kindness. The prisoners were herded into trucks, not cattle cars. They sat on benches, not on the floor. The guards didn't yell or point guns unless necessary. At every checkpoint, Hans expected the tone to change, for the mask to drop, but it never did. The Americans treated them as men, not as monsters. After several days of transit, the prisoners arrived at a temporary camp near Cherbourg. Rows of tents stretched across the muddy ground, but there were no scenes of cruelty. They were given warm soup, blankets, medical checks. The Red Cross visited. Some captured officers even wrote home. Hans began to hear whispers. Some of them might be sent across the ocean. At first, the rumor seemed ridiculous. Sent where? The idea that prisoners would be shipped to the United States sounded like fantasy. But the guards confirmed it. America had space, resources, and food, everything Europe had lost. They didn't want their camps in bombed-out France. The prisoners would be safer across the sea. So began the journey. It was late spring when Hans and hundreds of others were marched to the port. There, between the cranes and Liberty ships, he saw the full scale of Allied might. Cargo ships, tankers, freighters, all painted in gray camouflage, stretched across the horizon. Crates stamped USA towered beside the docks. Men in coveralls loaded them methodically, joking as they worked. Hans had never seen such calm efficiency. He realized something that chilled him, even after 5 years of war. The Americans looked fresh. Their uniforms were clean, their boots new, their faces rested. The war hadn't reached their soil. They fought without fear of starvation. The contrast was unbearable. The prisoners boarded a transport ship under heavy guard, but the process was almost civil. They were searched, registered, and sent below deck. The hold was crowded, but clean enough. The food, even at sea, astonished them. Canned meat, bread, fruit, and coffee. Real coffee? Hans couldn't remember the last time he'd tasted it. As the convoy set sail, the men leaned through portholes to glimpse the French coast fade into fog. No one spoke. They were leaving Europe behind, leaving everything they'd known, family, guilt, the shattered Reich, for something incomprehensible. Some feared they'd be taken as slaves. Others hoped they'd at least survive. The journey took weeks. The Atlantic rolled endlessly around them, deep and cold. The ship groaned in heavy weather, and many fell sick. Yet even here, small miracles persisted. The guards distributed magazines and cigarettes. When storms subsided, prisoners were allowed on deck in groups, guarded but free to breathe. Hans stood there once at sunset and saw an endless convoy, dozens of ships cutting through the sea in perfect order. Every one of them carried supplies or men or prisoners. He realized the sheer scale of what Germany had fought against. One night, the convoy passed a fleet of returning bombers overhead, engines droning like thunder. Someone beside him whispered, "That is how they won. Not with hatred, with machines that never stopped." Food remained plentiful. The Americans insisted on feeding their prisoners properly. They said starving men became desperate, and desperate men caused trouble. So they fed them, and it worked. The prisoners grew calmer, quieter, obedient. Each meal felt surreal. On deck, Hans overheard a guard complaining that rations were dull. Dull, the word made him laugh. For years, dull food would have been paradise. He began to understand something deeper. The Americans didn't see generosity as weakness. They saw it as routine, an extension of power. To feed your enemy without strain meant you'd already won. That confidence radiated from every soldier, every crewman, every crate stamped with the letters U.S. When the convoy neared the American coast, the prisoners crowded the railings. Hans caught the first glimpse of land, a thin gray line turning green, dotted with buildings and cranes. Norfolk, Virginia. The port looked alive, unscarred, as if the war had never happened. No ruins, no smoke, no broken windows. Cars moved freely. People walked in clean clothes. It was like seeing the future. The ship's engines slowed. Tugs guided it toward the docks. The prisoners stood silently, some trembling. None of them knew what awaited them on American soil. They had been told the U.S. was ruthless, but nothing about it looked like brutality. The air smelled of fuel and salt and baked bread from the port canteens. They disembarked slowly. Lines of soldiers directed them to processing tents, where clerks took names and assigned camp numbers. They were photographed, tagged, and handed personal cards marked PW. Every step was orderly. There was no shouting, no pushing. One officer told them through an interpreter, "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Work will be assigned. Food will be provided. Follow the rules, and there will be no punishment." It sounded unreal. They had expected cages. Instead, they were given rules, meals, and a strange kind of respect. Hans was sent inland by train. As the locomotive wound through the countryside, he pressed his face to the window. The land was endless. Rolling fields, barns, water towers painted with stars. Everywhere he looked, life thrived. No bomb craters, no burned villages. America looked untouched. He wondered if any German city would ever look like this again. The guards spoke easily among themselves, trading jokes and candy. One offered Hans a stick of gum. He hesitated before accepting. The guard just grinned. "Don't worry," he said. "We don't poison our prisoners." Hans smiled awkwardly, realizing how absurd his fears had become. At one stop, townspeople gathered near the tracks. They stared at the prisoners, curious but not angry. Some waved. A boy no older than 12 shouted, "Hey, Jerry, you guys hungry?" and held up a sandwich. The guards laughed and shooed him back. But Hans never forgot it. By the time they reached the camp, a sprawling enclosure surrounded by prairie, the fear had drained away, replaced by bewilderment. Wooden barracks stood neatly aligned, each with screened windows and bunks. There were water pumps, showers, even a recreation yard. It looked more like a summer settlement than a prison. The camp commandant greeted them in formal German, explaining the schedule: roll call, meals, work assignments, rest hours. "You will be treated as soldiers, not criminals," he said. "The war is over. You are guests of the United States until peace is declared." Guests? The word hung in the air like a question. That night, when dinner was served, it became undeniable. The trays were filled with stew, bread, potatoes, and something else. A bottle of Coca-Cola placed beside each plate. Hans turned it in his hand, reading the foreign letters, the brown glass glinting under electric light. He thought of his mother standing in line for bread back home. He thought of propaganda posters showing American cruelty. Then he took a sip. The sweetness was shocking. It fizzed on his tongue, unlike anything he'd tasted. He looked around. Others were doing the same, eyes wide, silent disbelief turning into laughter. Someone said softly, "If this is captivity, I will stay forever." Later, after lights out, Hans lay on his bunk, listening to crickets outside the barracks. For the first time since the war began, he wasn't afraid. He felt something he hadn't felt in years. Trust, not in politics, not in leaders, but in simple humanity. He didn't know it yet, but thousands of other prisoners across America were living the same moment, discovering that the enemy who had defeated them didn't want revenge. The Americans had already moved on to rebuilding, feeding, and forgiving died in the darkness. Hans smiled faintly, remembering the guard who'd offered him gum and the boy who'd waved from the train station. Maybe the war hadn't just ended on battlefields. Maybe it was ending in places like this, between men who had finally stopped believing the worst about each other. The next morning, sunlight streamed across the Kansas plains like a quiet promise. Dew glistened on the barbed wire. The prisoners filed into the mess hall, still half expecting the illusion to collapse. It didn't. The guards nodded them through the doorway as if greeting guests at a boarding school died inside. Breakfast smelled of coffee, toast, and bacon. Bacon. Hans hadn't smelled it in years. He stood frozen for a moment, staring at the trays being filled by American cooks in white aprons. The food wasn't ration scraps. It was real, generous, steaming hot. One of the cooks, a short man from Georgia, grinned as Hans passed. "Eat up, Jerry. We got plenty." That word again, plenty. It hung in his mind all morning like something foreign. The camp wasn't paradise, but it was ordered, humane, strangely alive. Rows of barracks stretched along gravel paths. There were workshops, a library, a chapel, even a baseball field. Prisoners tended small gardens, built furniture, played chess in the shade. The guards weren't lenient, but they weren't cruel either. Punishment was rare, reserved for fighting or escape attempts. Each man had an assigned task: kitchen help, farm labor, maintenance, translation, clerical work. The Americans called it rehabilitative work, a polite term for labor that filled the hours and eased the strain on local manpower. Hans was assigned to a nearby farm. He rode out each morning in a truck with a dozen others, a guard sitting casually in the front seat, rifle across his knees. The road stretched through endless fields of wheat and corn. To Hans, it felt like another world. No ruins, no bomb craters, no hunger. The farmer who met them was a tall man named Frank Reynolds. He shook their hands one by one, smiling as if they were hired help, not captives. "We'll keep it fair," he said. "You work, you eat, same as us." They worked under the wide American sky, the sun baking their backs, the wind carrying the smell of cut grain. It was hard work, but not punishment. At noon, Frank's wife brought sandwiches, cold milk, and a bucket of lemonade. Sometimes she even added a bottle of Coca-Cola, placing it on the truck's tailgate for them to share. The first time she did that, the men hesitated. They'd been taught that fraternizing was forbidden, but the guard only smiled. "Go on," he said. "She likes to spoil people." They drank slowly, savoring every sip. The farmer's wife laughed and said, "My boys over in Europe would be jealous." For Hans, that moment broke something deep inside, the invisible wall between conqueror and conquered. Here he was, a defeated soldier, drinking from the same bottle as the woman whose husband's country had crushed his, and she smiled at him without hate. Over the weeks, that strange normalcy deepened. In the evenings, they rode back to camp, dusty and tired, but with bellies full. Supper was hearty: stews, potatoes, vegetables, sometimes even pie. On Sundays, the camp kitchen made ice cream. It wasn't every week, but when it came, it was an event. A truck would arrive, carrying large metal tubs packed in dry ice. The cooks scooped it out in generous portions, serving both guards and prisoners alike. The first time Hans tasted it, he nearly laughed aloud. The cold hit his teeth, the sweetness flooded his tongue, and for a few seconds he forgot the war entirely. Around him, men grinned like children, spooning up vanilla and chocolate, as if it were treasure. Word spread quickly among the prisoners. The Americans eat like kings. Even their enemies eat like them. It became a kind of legend. Letters home mentioned it cautiously, not wanting to sound boastful or ungrateful, but they mentioned it nonetheless. "We have meat every day," one man wrote. "Sometimes ice cream. I think of you with every bite." The camp command enforced the Geneva Convention meticulously. Prisoners received the same caloric rations as U.S. soldiers. They were allowed to organize classes, form orchestras, publish small newsletters. Some even painted murals on the barrack walls. What had begun as captivity slowly became a community. The Americans understood something. The Germans didn't yet. Re-education didn't have to mean propaganda. It could mean exposure to fairness, abundance, and freedom of thought. And it worked. In the camp library, Hans found English primers, novels, and even magazines. He practiced words at night, repeating them softly. "Hello, thank you, good morning." The guards corrected him good-naturedly. One of them, a lanky kid from Ohio, traded lessons for cigarettes. They'd sit under the watchtower after work, the guard teaching slang, while Hans taught him German phrases. "What's the word for freedom again?" The guard asked one evening. "Freiheit," Hans said. "Freiheit," the American repeated, smiling. "I like that. Rolls off the tongue?" Hans smiled back. "You have much of it here." The guard nodded toward the open plains. "Yeah, guess we do." The prisoners began to notice how different America felt. Not just rich, but relaxed, confident, without arrogance. Even the guards seemed curious rather than vengeful. When the first snow fell that winter, they brought out coffee urns for the prisoners working outside. They shared blankets and gloves. Hans had never seen conquerors so casual about compassion. But the contrast with home weighed heavily. The men received censored letters from Germany, stories of bombed cities, ration lines, hunger. Some families hadn't eaten meat in months. The Red Cross reports confirmed the misery. Many prisoners cried reading them. That night, the mess hall fell silent as they ate. A few pushed away their trays. Hans couldn't. He felt guilty for being full while his mother starved. Yet he also felt grateful, because for the first time he knew what peace could look like. In January 1946, the camp celebrated Christmas late. The Americans called it a holiday dinner. The prisoners helped decorate the hall with paper stars. A chaplain read verses from the Bible, and then the kitchen doors swung open. Turkeys, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, and, astonishingly, Coca-Cola bottles placed at every seat. The men sang carols in both German and English. Some of the guards joined in. At the end of the meal, someone started laughing softly. It spread until the entire hall was echoing with it. Laughter that sounded like life returning after years of silence. The next morning, a rumor swept the camp. A local town was inviting POS to a community dinner. A gesture of goodwill. It seemed impossible, even dangerous. But it was true. The war was over, and the people wanted to move forward. Hans was among those chosen to attend. The guards escorted them to a school gymnasium where long tables were laid out with food. Roasted ham, corn, pies, cakes, and rows of glass bottles chilling in ice. Coca-Cola again, gleaming like liquid amber. The townspeople welcomed them cautiously, but soon conversation began. A farmer asked Hans where he was from. A child asked what Germany was like. An elderly woman poured him coffee. There were no speeches, no politics, just shared food and hesitant smiles. Hans watched a young American soldier hold his baby sister on his lap. The girl offered the soldier her spoonful of ice cream, and he laughed. Something inside Hans shifted. He realized that the people he'd been told to hate were not monsters. They were ordinary, kind, flawed, and alive. When they returned to camp that night, the prisoners sat quietly in the barracks, each lost in thought. One said, "I think I understand now why we lost. Not because they had more weapons, because they had more of this." He gestured at the half-empty bottle of Coca-Cola beside his bunk. They had more humanity. The months passed, and the camp grew almost peaceful. Prisoners sent crafts home, wooden toys, paintings, handmade wallets. The guards helped them ship them through the Red Cross. Some wrote that they wanted to come back to America someday, to work or study. The bitterness had drained away. Hans never forgot one afternoon when a storm hit. The fields turned to rivers, tents blew down, and the power failed. The Americans ran through the mud, shouting, trying to fix things. Without orders, the prisoners joined them. They worked side by side, hauling sandbags, repairing lines, lighting lanterns. When it was over, both sides collapsed in laughter, soaked and exhausted. No one spoke of sides anymore. There were just men trying to keep warm. Later, as the war trials began in Europe, rumors reached the camp about what had been found in Germany. The camps, the atrocities. Some prisoners wept openly, unable to reconcile their service with what their leaders had done. The American officers didn't lecture them. They just said, "Now you see why we fight." Hans understood. For the first time, he saw the war not as betrayal or loss, but as awakening. Spring came again. The war was long over. Orders for repatriation arrived. Groups of men were sent home in stages. As they packed, the guards handed each of them small farewell bags, a sandwich, an apple, and one last bottle of Coca-Cola. When Hans stepped aboard the transport truck, he turned to look back. The camp lay quiet under the morning sun, fences, watchtowers, the fields beyond glowing with wheat. He thought of the laughter, the music, the ice cream that had melted too fast, the kindness that had healed something deep in him. He lifted the bottle, still cold from the crate, and took one last drink. The taste was sharp and sweet. It no longer surprised him. It reminded him of everything he had learned in captivity, that mercy was power, that dignity could outlast defeat, that humanity itself was the truest victory. The guards waved as the trucks rolled away. One shouted, "Good luck, boys." Another added, "Don't forget us." The prisoners waved back. Hans smiled, holding his bottle tight. He would never forget, years later, when he was an old man sitting in a rebuilt Germany. He kept a single Coca-Cola bottle on his shelf, empty, dusty, but treasured. Visitors would ask about it, and he'd smile faintly. That, he'd say, was the first taste of peace. The train rattled east through the wreckage of Europe. Outside the windows, villages lay flattened, chimneys like broken teeth against the pale horizon. For weeks now, the convoys of repatriated prisoners had been winding their way across the Atlantic, through France, through Belgium, and into a Germany that barely existed. The men in those cars were silent. They had left behind the green fields of Kansas, the laughter of guards, the smell of coffee and clean linen. Ahead of them waited the ruins of home. Hans Keller sat with his hands folded, staring at his reflection in the window. The glass shook with every turn of the wheels. In the corner, someone hummed a tune, Glenn Miller, learned from an American guard. Others smiled faintly at the sound. For a moment, they could almost pretend they were still back there, where fences were made of wire, but life had felt strangely free. They crossed the Rhine at night. The river below was dark and silent, the bridges temporary and twisted with girders. Beyond it lay cities they barely recognized. Cologne, Bonn, Kassel. The train stopped often, each time greeted by faces hollowed by hunger. Children pressed against the doors, asking for bread. Hans reached into his pack and handed out what little he had, a few American rations, a chocolate bar he'd saved since the voyage. The children's eyes widened. Their mother whispered, "Danke, mein Jung." "Thank you, my boy." He wanted to tell her he was one of the defeated, one of the reasons she had nothing, but she already knew. She didn't care. The chocolate melted in the children's hands, and for a moment they smiled, and that was enough. When the train reached Thuringia, Hans stepped down onto the cracked platform. The air smelled of smoke and spring earth. His town was half destroyed. The church had no roof. His family home still stood, but barely walls scarred, windows broken. Inside, his mother sat beside a small stove, her hands blackened with soot. She looked up as he entered and froze. For a second, she didn't recognize him. Then she cried his name and ran to him. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but reality was quieter. She was thin, her clothes patched, her eyes older than he remembered. She touched his face, as if afraid he might vanish. "You lived?" she whispered. "I lived," he said. He couldn't find the words to explain how. That night, he told her about America. Not everything, just fragments. The camp, the fields, the food. When he mentioned the Coca-Cola, she laughed weakly, not believing. They gave you soda. 2 prisoners. Yes, he said. Every week? And ice cream too. She shook her head slowly. You must be mistaken. He didn't argue. How could he describe a world of abundance to someone who boiled weeds for soup? How could he explain that the enemy had treated him better than his own government had treated its citizens? Over the following weeks, Hans walked the streets of his ruined town. Everywhere he saw ghosts of what once was. Bakeries gutted, children scavenging rubble, men trading cigarettes for bread. He visited the old school where he'd studied before the war. It was a skeleton of stone and dust. The local factory was gone. The machines melted for scrap iron. And yet, amid the wreckage, he began to notice something new. Signs painted by Allied forces announcing care distribution today. Trucks unloading boxes marked martial aid, and, unbelievably, American soldiers smiling as they handed out powdered milk and canned meat. The war was over, but the generosity had not stopped. It was like seeing the camp all over again, only now the fences were gone. Hans offered to translate for the distribution team. He spoke decent English now, and the Americans were grateful for help. He guided families through the process, explaining what each package contained. One day, while unpacking a crate, he froze. Inside were small glass bottles with red labels. Coca-Cola. He stared for a long time, then laughed quietly. He took one bottle home that night. His mother tasted it carefully, her eyes widening. It's sweet, she said softly. Too sweet, it tastes like the end of hate, Hans answered. She didn't understand, but she smiled anyway. Over the next months, Germany struggled to breathe again. Cities cleared rubble, factories reopened, rail lines creaked back to life. Hans found work translating for the local occupation office. He met other former POWs who had returned from America, and their stories were all the same: disbelief, kindness, food, and the shock of freedom. They gathered in cafes that had no coffee, talking about the things they'd seen: jukeboxes, cars without drivers, houses with electric refrigerators. One of them, a man from Bremen, said, in the camps, they told us we would be re-educated. I think they succeeded. They didn't change our minds with books. They changed them with food. Hans nodded. They showed us what dignity looks like. The idea spread quietly that America's victory wasn't just military, but moral. Its real weapon had been its abundance, its confidence and generosity. The former POS began to teach those values at home. They were hired as foremen, engineers, teachers. They insisted on fairness, discipline, and tolerance. Slowly, that spirit took root in the soil of a broken nation. By 1949, the war was a memory, but Coca-Cola was not. The company built its first bottling plant in West Germany, and soon the red logo appeared everywhere, on walls, in cafes, beside railway stations. Too many Germans. It wasn't just a drink. It was a symbol of a new beginning of peace that could be touched and tasted. Hans couldn't help smiling when he saw children carrying bottles through the streets, just as he once had in captivity. Years later, when he married and had children of his own, he would sometimes tell them about the camp. We went there as prisoners, he'd say, and came back as witnesses. His children would listen wide-eyed as he described the ice cream truck, the baseball games, the farmers who treated them like neighbors. They'd ask if he ever hated the Americans. He would shake his head. No, he'd say. They taught me that you can defeat an army without destroying its soul. In the early 1960s, Hans visited America again, this time freely. He stood on the same plains where the camp once stood, now an open field with a plaque that read, Site of German Prisoner of War Camp, 1944 to 1946. May history remember mercy. The wind carried the scent of cut grass and gasoline from distant highways. He closed his eyes and could almost hear the hum of the freezer truck, the laughter of men tasting ice cream for the first time. He met Frank Reynolds' son at the local diner. The man shook his hand warmly and said, My father remembered you, said you worked harder than anyone he'd hired. They drank coffee together, and Hans told him how that kindness had shaped his life. Before leaving, he stopped at a small store and bought a bottle of Coca-Cola. He drank it slowly on the drive back, watching the sun sink over the fields. The taste hadn't changed. It was still sweet, still sharp. still carrying the memory of a day when enemies had become men again. Back in Germany, the world moved on. The Cold War came and went. The Berlin Wall fell. Hans grew old. But every year, on the anniversary of his capture, he'd take that old bottle down from the shelf, pour himself a small drink, and sit by the window. He'd think about the faces of the guards, the farmers, the people who had shown mercy when vengeance would have been easy. He'd remember the laughter in the mess hall, the hum of the generator, the clang of spoons against tin bowls, the fizz of soda under the prairie sun. Sometimes he'd whisper to himself, "They conquered us with kindness." And perhaps that was the truest ending of the war, not in treaties or parades, but in quiet acts of humanity that rewrote the hearts of men. For those who had tasted starvation, the memory of food would always carry more than flavor. For Hans and thousands like him, Coca-Cola and ice cream weren't luxuries. They were proof that mercy could exist in victory. When he died in 1992, his grandchildren found that empty bottle still sitting on the shelf. The label had faded, but the glass was clear. They kept it, not as a relic of war, but as a reminder that even in the darkest of times, one act of compassion can outlive every bullet and every bomb in the end. The story of the German POWs, who thought they'd starve only to be fed by their former enemies, wasn't just about food. It was about the moment when war stopped being about hatred and became a lesson in humanity. Because sometimes, history turns not on who fired first, but on who chose to feed the other side.